At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community.
Hi, I'm Cameron Zeck, and on this episode of At the Edge of It All, we talk with Professor Daniel Cartamil all about sharks.
Yeah, he talked to us a little bit about how important shark conservation is and also why you shouldn't fear sharks. Let's take a listen.
So Daniel, thanks so much for being with us. Your work focuses on sharks and also stingrays. A really interesting topic. We'd love to start, though, first with how did you get interested in this specific area of research?
Well, the way I got interested in sharks was actually quite accidental. So I'm always telling my students to get as much field experience as they can and volunteer experience, because that's kind of how I got into sharks. I volunteered to work at a marine biology research station after my undergrad degree, just strictly on a volunteer basis. And it turned out to be a shark research facility. I didn't even know that when I volunteered. And so within, a week, we were out in the middle of the sea in the Bahamas tracking sharks and tagging them and doing all kinds of studies. And I was just completely hooked, no pun intended, from that point on.
Great. And your work looks specifically at thresher sharks. What are thresher sharks?
Yeah, so I don't exclusively work on thresher sharks, but I did do my PhD on threshers, and they have been the focus of a lot of my research. So the thresher shark is a pretty large shark that migrates up and down the west coast of North America, and so they can get to be about 20 feet in length, which is really large. But the really interesting thing about them is their tail is about the same length as the rest of their body. So if you have an 8-foot thresher shark, it's got an additional 8 feet of tail, and it uses that tail as a whip to stun its prey. So it's very unique in that regard. It's a very interesting animal. One of the other reasons I'm really interested in it is, besides the fact that it's interesting from a biological standpoint, it's also the basis of a commercial fishery in the U.S. and in Mexico. So they're really good to eat. People like to catch them and eat them. And so a lot of the work I do is conservation oriented. And so I'm very interested in finding ways to make this thresher shark population a little more resilient to commercial fishing.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that, because it is sort of a partnership between Mexico and the U.S. for this, right? Of trying to conserve this shark. And why is that important? Why should people at home care? Because at the end of the day, if there is no more thresher shark, then it kind of impacts the ecosystem, right, in our waters?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the way I got into the international aspect of studying thresher sharks is that I was doing my PhD and studying thresher sharks off of San Diego and all the way up to Santa Barbara. And we study these sharks with electronic tags. So we put the tag on the shark, and then it will report for up to a year, telling us where the shark has gone and what it's doing, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that a lot of the sharks were moving south of the border into Mexican waters off of Baja California. And so that realization sparked really like this huge change in my career, where I started to focus on what is the connection between U.S. and Mexican populations of thresher sharks. The reason it's important is because if we're commercially fishing for thresher sharks in the United States, we put certain regulations on that fishery to make sure it's sustainable. But if they're then moving into the waters offshore of another country like Mexico, and they're not fishing sustainably, then that's a major problem, because the population could collapse, and we're doing the best we can, but meanwhile another country is not necessarily managing it properly. So the whole purpose of teaming up, so to speak, with Mexican researchers and Mexican fisheries managers and politicians was to kind of get this big consortium together of U.S. and Mexican entities and agencies that could team together to tackle this problem. And so that's why it's really important, because, fish are a major food source for a lot of, especially coastal communities, and especially in Mexico. So it's really important that they be managed sustainably. And it can't happen unless, especially in the case of a highly migratory fish like the thresher shark that spends half the year in Mexico and half the year in the United States. If both countries are managing it properly and cooperating, then we've got a chance. And I'm really happy to say, actually, that as a result of teaming up with all these Mexican agencies and forming a consortium, we're able to share information and really influence each other to the point where both the U.S. and Mexico ratified a lot of their regulations and laws around shark fishing, and so we have made some really good progress, and it looks like thresher shark populations are starting to rebound pretty considerably.
Great. Aside from that, you've done a lot of research on shark migration, and you kind of touched on a little bit of how the sharks travel all the way down to Baja, which seems like such a long distance. What have you learned about shark migration? What kind of sharks are in our own backyard? What are their migration habits from the ones that you've studied? And what does that process look like?
Well, the process looks like, for my personal research, the process looks like using different kinds of electronic tags. Some of them are long-term tags, which we can use to study migration. So those tags will ride on the shark for a year, and then they'll pop off the shark and transmit all their data. And so that's kind of a long-term look. On the other end of the spectrum is we do a lot of short-term studies where we attach transmitters that you actually have to be following the shark around in a boat to collect the data. So that gives us a lot of information on the fine scale movements. So for example, we might learn through one tag about how they travel from Canada to central Baja, but using the more local tags, we might learn how they use the waters off La Jolla while they're here in the spring and summer. And it teaches us a lot about, for example, how different sections of the population use different habitats. So for example, one of the major findings we found with thresher sharks is that the juveniles will typically inhabit very shallow coastal waters. And the adults, once they reach a certain size, then they move offshore and they have a completely different habitat. So they're almost kind of isolated, the juvenile and the adult populations. And we've been finding this for various types of shark species, like soupfin sharks is another species that we study that migrates up and down the west coast. And one thing we found with them is that the males seem to be in one place for most of the year, and the females are in a completely different area. And so all of these little snippets of information are really useful for fisheries management. If you want to protect a portion of the population that is perhaps more sensitive, say pregnant females, you don't want to fish all the pregnant females for obvious reasons, then you won't have the next generation of sharks to repopulate. So you can maybe protect a certain area. You can protect a certain, you can regulate fishing so that perhaps they're only fishing at a certain time of day when the pregnant females wouldn't be in a certain level of the water column. So there's all, you can get more and more sophisticated. And that's really the main reason we do this, is to find strategies for useful fisheries management.
Is there a reason that the sharks travel, like as far as Canada all the way to Baja? Is it based on water temperatures, food, and have you seen any changes in behavior with just what we're seeing with climate change at all?
Yeah, well, that part is actually tricky. Because we don't have enough of a sample size really to be able to say for sure. We're still in the initial stages of, as much as work as we've done, we still don't understand like the larger scale pattern. The bigger the pattern, like migration, the harder it is to study. So what it looks like is, it is of course temperature related, but the temperature it's not so much because it's the temperature the sharks want to be in, it's because it's the temperature that the shark's prey wants to be in. So really the sharks are following their prey, which are sardines and anchovies. And so during colder water years, when the sardines and anchovies are a little further south, we'll find the sharks there too. And sometimes during warmer water years, like an El Nino, they might go all the way up into almost Alaskan waters as they follow their prey. up to those areas. We haven't really. So again, like in other studies have found correlations between things like climate change and migration, but we haven't found that yet, mainly because our sample size is too small, and climate change is happening at a rate where it's very difficult to study.
Whether it be from hearing about sharks in movies or seeing, maybe a shark bite in the news, when people hear sharks, they sometimes are fearful of it. So what do you think people should know about how sharks interact with people? And do you think there's a need to be fearful, or what do you find when you're researching them?
Yeah, there's certainly no reason to be fearful. Like for example, here in San Diego, the odds of being the victim of a shark attack in San Diego are so astronomically low, and yet I know a lot of people that don't want to go into the water because they're scared of sharks. And yet, if you go to La Jolla, I had a student today that was showing me pictures from this past weekend. They were snorkeling in La Jolla Cove with 100 leopard sharks. And so, it can actually be a very pleasant interaction when there's sharks around. And I think what most people don't realize is that the sharks are there, even the bigger sharks that are maybe a little more scary than leopard sharks, things like 7-gill sharks that come from deeper water, and they might come up into the kelp forest, or juvenile white sharks. They may be 6 to 8 feet in size. They're all over the coast now. And that's a good thing. It means that, shark populations are becoming healthier every year because of regulations that have been put into place to limit fishing on things like white sharks, for example. So I think it's really important for people to realize that sharks are an indicator of a healthy oceanic ecosystem. And so the more sharks there are, the better. The only time you really have to worry about sharks is if you live in a place where shark attack is a legitimate and well-known concern. So maybe if you live off of San Francisco and you're a surfer, then yeah, you might want to pay attention to, if there's adult white sharks around, because they might mistake you for a seal or something like that. But for 90% of the world, going into the water should be a completely benign experience.
And why is that different in San Francisco versus San Diego? Do we not have adult white sharks here?
Right. So the white shark, like all sharks, has a very complicated life cycle. But it's, for the most part, the adults tend to concentrate, and like we were talking about before, adults and juveniles tend to segregate in different areas. So the adults tend, on the West Coast, they certainly like to be off of the San Francisco area, like the Farallon Islands, because that's where a lot of seals are. And they're warm-blooded critters. The adult white sharks have an elevated body temperature, so they seek out colder waters. So if you're up there, there would be more adult white sharks. Whereas off of San Diego, we typically have juvenile white sharks. So once the white sharks are born, they will travel up and down the coast fairly close to the shore. And so here in San Diego, I've been amazed to see the increase in juvenile white shark numbers over the last 2 decades, to the point where now we have consistent aggregations of juvenile white sharks in various places in San Diego County. You can go right now and go see white sharks swimming around near the coast. And there's always surfers there. I have yet to hear of any negative interactions. If there ever is, it's usually, some kind of mistake, like somebody kicked a shark in the face by accident when they were surfing, and maybe they got a bite, or, but even those kind of interactions are fairly rare.
Before we wrap up, we also want to talk about another project that you have, photographing sharks. And really the effort is about conservation, of having people learn more about sharks and the importance of conservation. Tell us a little bit about that, because you do a lot of photography.
Yeah, I do a lot. It's kind of an interesting thing how careers go in the sciences. My career took a major turn about when I started working in Baja California, because we were visiting all these shark fishing camps trying to collect data. on what kind of sharks they're catching, and we're learning all about shark populations off of the Baja California Peninsula. But to get to all these remote locations, you typically have to travel several hours through very remote desert regions. And so we would end up just camping, all these remote places. And I couldn't believe how beautiful it was there. And I was doing a lot of photography. I realized that nobody had really properly documented this area photographically. And so I was able to procure some funds and spend time doing a conservation photography project, the goal of which was to really kind of highlight the fragility and beauty of these ecosystems. And kind of the idea is that through art, people become aware of these things and become more conservation minded. Even if the message in the book isn't necessarily that explicit about conservation, I really believe that just the power of art has the power to turn people's hearts that way. And so this is the book. It's called Baja's Wild Side, and it's published by a local publisher, Sunbelt. And it highlights. It's not really all about sharks necessarily, although it does touch on that subject, but it's more about the overall habitat and the landscapes, and also the culture of Baja California, which is a wonderful culture as well. It includes the ranchers and also remnants of ancient civilizations. Baja has been populated probably for close to 20,000 years. And so there's a lot of cave art and rock carvings in very obscure, remote places of the peninsula, and that's really fascinating to me as well. So that's all what's covered in this book. And right now I'm working on a second book that is a follow-up to this that will be kind of a much more expanded version of this book.
And where can people find that book?
They can find it on Amazon,
okay, great.
Baja's Wild Side, or the Sunbelt Publishing website.
Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. We learned a lot about sharks, and I think it was super interesting. So thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to catch the next one.